The following production is presented by League InfoSite and the Credit Union Broadcast Experience, CubeTV.
Hello, I'm Sean Wolbert with CubeTV. Thank you for joining me at the CU Compliance Connection by InfoSite. At the NCUA board meeting on January 10th, the National Credit Union Administration amended the definition of a small entity, raising the asset threshold from $10 million to $50 million. The reason for this change varies. The Regulatory Flexibility Act requires federal agencies to determine and specially consider the impact of proposed and final rules on small entities. Since 2003, the NCUA has defined a small entity as a credit union with less than $10 million in assets. It has been a full 10 years since this definition has changed. The NCUA considered increasing the asset threshold because of a concern that the threshold affecting regulatory relief for small, federally insured credit unions was outdated. The NCUA also wanted to ease the regulatory burdens of small credit unions. By proposing an increase in the threshold, the NCUA board intended to account for industry asset growth, consolidation, and inflation while avoiding undue risk to the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund. In the future, this threshold will be reviewed initially within 2 years and then every 3 years, along with all other NCUA regulations. This more regular review will encourage a more responsive management of industry conditions. In determining the threshold increase to $50 million, the NCUA board evaluated industry characteristics and risk data. They also considered the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act reporting threshold set by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There was also great industry support and input through comment calls that requested the $50 million asset threshold. The NCUA also reviewed the historical threshold and reasoning behind the limit. In 1998, the small entity asset threshold was set at $10 million, and at the time, qualifying credit unions represented 561.2% of the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund. Using the $50 million threshold today represents 569.6% of the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund. Additionally, the percentage of industry assets and net worth covered under the threshold remain within 1 percentage point of the 1998 ratios. With a change in the asset threshold for the Regulatory Flexibility Act to $50 million, more than 4,600 credit unions will qualify as a small entity. This rule change means that 2,270 additional credit unions now fall under the NCUA's small credit union definition. The change to the small entity threshold also affects the definition of a complex credit union. This update will increase the number of federally insured credit unions removed from the definition of complex based on asset size alone by an additional 2,270 credit unions. The increase eliminates the possibility that these credit unions could become subject to the additional prompt corrective action issues by regulators for provisions due solely to risk-based net worth requirements. Another positive impact of this change affects the NCUA's new interest rate risk rule. The new $50 million threshold excludes around 2,270 more federally insured credit unions from complying with the interest rate risk rule based on their asset size alone. Once again, this change brings the total credit unions excluded to around 4,670. The prior version of the regulation required federally insured credit unions between $10 and $50 million in assets, holding combined first mortgages and investments with maturities greater than 5 years, that equal or exceeded net worth to adopt and implement an interest rate risk policy. Of the approximately 2,270 additional federal credit unions that this final rule excludes, 992 are no longer required by regulation to adopt and implement an interest rate risk policy. The threshold change will also increase access to the Office of Small Credit Union Initiatives. The Office of Small Credit Union Initiatives was formed to foster credit union development and effective delivery of financial services, facility expansion of credit union services, and coordinate efforts with third-party organizations, and to improve the viability and successful operation of credit unions. Based on the increase in the number of credit unions who will qualify as small entities, the NCUA Office of Small Credit Unions has reorganized and is preparing to handle the potential increase in workload by redesigning its services on delivery to focus on impact and self-help. Economic development specialists are changing to a triad approach, providing consulting services more efficiently by phone, web, group training, and referral as an alternative to the previous on-site visits. Webinar training will now be more prevalent than in-person workshops, and the Office of Small Credit Union Initiatives recently unveiled a microsite which will include a resource center to provide self-help to credit unions. These changes will permit the NCUA to provide assistance to credit unions falling below the $50 million threshold without additional staffing. NCUA Board Chairman Debbie Matz stated of the board action that small credit unions are essential to their communities and fill a niche other financial institutions can't. The change to the Regulatory Flexibility Act threshold will ensure that the regulatory burden will be more consistently considered for approximately 2,270 additionally federally insured credit unions. The NCUA has stated that future regulations will be more thoroughly evaluated to determine whether credit unions below the $50 million in assets should be exempted from some of the provisions separately considered before finalization. We have come to the end of this regulatory review, which, contrary to the norm, has a positive effect on the credit union industry. Please stay tuned to the Compliance Connection for detailed reviews of the CFPB's regulatory actions. Thank you for joining me. I'm Shawn Wolbert with the CU Compliance Connection by InfoSight, only on Cube TV.
Thanks for watching the #1 compliance program for the credit union community. Stay tuned.